modeling low resolution in-game assets. This is going to be mainly the core of this training product, not the complete subject, but one of the main important fundamental principles here is being able to model these objects for your game. Now, the goal with doing this is to create real-time geometry that looks good and performs just as good, if not better. Okay? Now, this is very important. Okay? There's no science to this. There's no 10-step process to doing this. This is an art form. You have to have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge of what you're doing in order to be able to balance this out. So I really can't tell you a 3-step process, like I mentioned, to get this done. There's a lot of factors that come into play, but I will show you techniques so that you can go ahead and get this done on your own and just create really good geometry that's going to look nice for the player to look at your graphics and see a great game, but also be able to play a game that plays very well. Okay, so modeling for games. One important principle that I want to mention here is to focus on modeling the overall shape as closely as possible. Alright? Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the overall shape, the silhouette of the object, should be modeled pretty close. So let me see if I can show you here an example. Let's jump into Softimage here. Okay? Let's look at something like this cable that's kind of just hanging out right here in the ceiling of our warehouse. So what I'm going to do is let me go over here and let me isolate selection inside of Softimage. So we have this cable here. If we get really close, we can see the faceting, and by that I mean these hard edges here where there's very low resolution. So you can see here that we have an edge here, so the object has sort of this really harsh angle to it right there. Right here it doesn't look very round. Okay, if we wanted it to look as round as possible, we would do something like this. So you can see now the object has been subdivided and it looks perfectly round. But if I go back to its original state, it looks very, very squarish. Okay, but when we look at it from a pretty good distance, it has the overall shape and form. It actually kind of looks round, and that's what the player is going to see in the game. But we don't end up creating tons and tons of geometry, because if I show you here what it looks like when I smooth this thing out, look at all the geometry we have. This looks perfectly round, but if I take this to the Unity engine, we're going to be wasting a lot of resources on this one cable. And if we have 25 of these cables hanging out from the ceiling, plus the rest of the environment, plus the main character in the game, plus bad guys, enemies running around the game blowing stuff up, you're going to have yourself a very slow game. Okay, you'll be lucky if you can squeeze 10 frames a second out of that game. So the idea is to create geometry that follows the overall shape and form as closely as possible to what you need, but at the same time not waste a lot of triangles on stuff that you don't need. Okay, so that's very, very important. So if I show you here on one of these oil drums, if I look at these oil drums and we look at the geometry here real quick, you can clearly see here that the oil drum has a good amount of triangles or polygons around this top silhouette, this top edge. So when we look at the silhouette here, okay, if you look at the silhouette there of the edge of the oil drum against the background there, which is the floor, it looks very round. And it does look a little bit dinged up. Of course, that's by design, because this is supposed to be an old oil drum that, has been dinged up pretty good over time. It's an abandoned warehouse, so it's not going to be perfectly round. But you can see that the silhouette looks pretty good. And we didn't use a ridiculous amount of triangles. We used a good amount, enough to make this look nice and round for the player. So when the player walks by and looks at that in the environment, it looks believable. If I had done this with maybe less polygons on the edges, then it wouldn't look that good. It would look more like a PlayStation 1 game, and that obviously wouldn't look good by today's standards. So we use a good amount of triangles to get stuff to look as good as possible. But we don't go too crazy, we don't take this and subdivide it this much. This would make it look very nice and round, but you could see all the geometry it has. It's way too heavy, and we don't want to put that inside of our game engine, inside of Unity, okay? So very important. So that's to illustrate what I mean by following the overall shape as closely as possible. Now, modeling detail, should be left only for important assets. So when you want to use up a lot of triangles, make sure you focus them on something important, like the main character of your game and things that are going to be shown close up to the camera, stuff like that. Topology, very important. Make sure you triangulate your meshes before you go in engine, or else the exporting process will do it for you automatically, and this is not good because it can lead to some problems with your meshes getting triangulated the wrong way. So optimization, very important. Priority of detail. Okay, this touches more on what I just spoke about a moment ago. You want to model detail only on important assets. So, for example, say you have a racing car game. You want to focus your polygons on the car that the player drives in the racing car game, because usually in a racing car game there's a camera that follows the car from a third-person view very closely, or maybe even an in-dash view inside the cabin of the car. And in that case, you want those assets to be very high-res as much as possible, because that's what the player is going to be staring at all the time when he plays the game. So if that's what the player is going to be looking at, you want to make sure that that object or those objects are the best looking objects possible in your game. Okay? And environment props that are farther from the camera or the point of view of the player should get less detail. So if I jump back to the warehouse scene over here, you can see here that, for example, these oil drums are seen by the player pretty close up because they're at the player's level right here. Say the player's head was about right here. If the player looks at this, they're going to see these oil drums from pretty close up. But an object that's really far away from the camera, like let's say for example, maybe these air ducts. If you look at these air ducts, they're not too high res, they're pretty simple. If you look at this piece of the air duct, it's extremely simple, very basic object here. If I isolate this, you can see it's a very basic object. Since the player never, flies up there or looks at that in detail, then you shouldn't waste your polygon count or your triangles on something like that. Instead, use that on something more important, like an enemy that your character is trying to shoot, or something that's close to the character. So optimizing is very important as well. You should use the least amount of triangles possible in order to optimize things. However, don't be afraid of pushing the limit, okay? If we were talking about 4 or 5 years ago, yeah, triangle counts have a big impact on the game performance. However, nowadays, most engines, including Unity, can handle a lot of triangles, okay, for next-gen games. Most hardware as well. Most high-end video cards that are coming out on the market nowadays, they can handle very, very powerful games that push triangle limits to the max. So don't be afraid of pushing Unity pretty far. Unity can handle a lot of triangles. You'd be very surprised at what it can do. Okay? So don't be afraid to do that. Also, this is one thing. A lot of people, especially newcomers to game development, will ask a very basic question. Okay? How many triangles should I place the limit on for my characters or my environment or whatever it is I'm doing? Well, the truth is, there's no magic number. No one can tell you the exact number of triangles for your game. This differs based on lots of factors. Some factors are the type of game you're making. So for example, let's say you're making your game like Dynasty Warriors, and if you're not familiar with that game, that's a game where the player, it's a third-person view action game, and it has these huge battles. So you'll be a player, and you'll be fighting 20, 25 enemies on screen at the same time, plus there's more characters in the background. So if you're doing a game where there's a huge battlefield, and there's 100 characters on screen at the same time, you obviously will not be able to do a game where each character has 10,000 triangles. You're going to have to reduce the amount of triangles per character. Okay, so that's a factor that could come into play. Also, the target platform and hardware that you're targeting has a huge say in how many triangles you use. So, for example, if you're making a game for, say, an Android phone, your main character in the game is going to have to be a very small amount of triangles. You might have to limit your triangle count to maybe 300-400, something like that. Just depends on the game you're making. Now, if you're making a game for the Xbox 360 or the PS3 or a high-end PC, running the latest, NVIDIA GeForce GTX video card or something like that, then what you're going to need is you can push the triangle counts further. Maybe your main character can be something like 10,000 triangles, maybe more. Just depends on what kind of game you're making. Okay? And there's many more factors that come into play. I can't cover every single one, but that's just to give you a good idea. Okay, so no one can tell you what triangle limits you should put on your characters and stuff. You're going to have to do some R&D. Some basic guidelines are available in the Unity documentation. Keep your main character about 10,000 triangles, give or take a few hundred or a few thousand from that. Just depends on your game. But I definitely encourage you to try to push it to the maximum that you possibly can without hurting performance on your game. You'd be very surprised, again, how powerful Unity actually is. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we're going to actually start going over examples, and I'm going to actually start putting some of these theories and ideas to use and showing you how to model some of the stuff that I did for this warehouse scene inside of Unity.